Hello, Dinuba Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to our online video Bible study of the letters of John. We've been taking a look at three books, way at the back of the Bible in the New Testament that talk about two of the most important things we could ever spend our time thinking about and contemplating, and that is who Jesus is and who we as his followers are supposed to be. It's a message that was very timely and very relevant when it was written in the first century, and it's also very timely and relevant here at the beginning of the 21st century. I know this has kind of been a whirlwind tour through these three closely interrelated books, and as we said last week, this is the last week of our study in these books, but we're actually going to find ourselves coming back to some of the themes that we addressed at the very beginning of our time looking into the letters of John. So let's dive in for one more look here at these books of the Bible. John lived during a very unique period of history, one that is without any real parallel in any other era that had come before John lived and that has come after John lived. For John's generation and for the select thousands or tens of thousands who were in and around Galilee and Jerusalem in the early 30s AD, God was visible as a human being, a man named Jesus of Nazareth. Not everyone in this very fortunate group who got to see him realized that when they looked at this humble Galilean carpenter, they were looking at a revelation of God and the mysterious, glorious dual nature of a person who was fully divine and fully human all at the same time. Some thought he was a particularly gifted teacher, or perhaps even a man possessed by a demon giving him supernatural power. Some dismissed him as just another rabble-rousing Jew in a sea teeming with Pharisees, Sadducees, and Zealots and their unrest in a first-century Judea that was struggling under Roman oppression. But still others, like John, realized that to be in the presence of Jesus was to be in the presence of God the Father. But more than simply being near to God, they were with God, together in time and in space with Jesus. They could see him and touch him. They could see him smile and feel his hand on their shoulder. They could hear the words that he was speaking. They could hear him laugh. They could hear him weep. And even more than that, as we talked about in the first week of our series, John was one of a select few who saw Jesus glorified in the Transfiguration, up on that mountaintop. He witnessed perhaps the most direct, visible manifestation of God since the time of Moses, and a greater manifestation than what Moses saw. We've seen over the last few weeks how John's experience of Jesus shaped his writing, but also his concern for the generations of the church that would come after him. Perhaps because of the words of Jesus that John recorded in the high priestly prayer, in which Jesus prayed specifically on behalf of the generations of believers who would come later in time, John realized that his experience was going to be vastly different than the experience of succeeding generations of the church faithful. We've seen that John labored earlier in the First John document to pass along the fullness of his understanding of Jesus as fully God and fully man. And later in First John, we will find that John labors to pass along not just a way of understanding, but a way of acting in the world that will address this problem of the generations who have never seen Jesus. Those who came to faith in Jesus after his ascension, and those who were born after Jesus' ministry on earth, find themselves right back in the same situation as before the disciples' generation. Jesus has already ascended to be with the Father in heaven. God is, once again, invisible. As a friend and a mentor of mine likes to say, the invisibility of God is perhaps the greatest impediment to the worship of God and to our discipleship as followers of Jesus. We are asked to pattern our lives and shape our activity and praise someone who cannot be seen. We cannot use our eyes. We can only use our faith. And this is a situation that John takes up after he introduces his criteria for testing the spirits in the First John letter. John looks at how the church can make God visible to strengthen the faith of those who, unlike him, did see Jesus in person. And as he looks at how the church can make God visible, so that an unbelieving world can recognize Jesus for who he is, he writes this, starting in John chapter 4 in verse 7. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world, so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. By this we know that we abide in him and he in us, because he has given us of his Spirit. And we have seen and testify that the Father has sent his Son to be the Savior of the world. Whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him, and he in God. So we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this is love perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment, because as he is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, for fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. We love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him: whoever loves God must also love his brother. In John's view, God is made visible through the visible, tangible actions the church takes to care for the members of its community. Last week we looked at the idea that love is the method by which the spiritual reality of our salvation in Jesus is turned into tangible, visible action in the world. The more our actions and our attitudes toward one another become like Jesus's attitudes and actions, the more we show Jesus to ourselves and to the world. For Jewish Christians who had grown up being educated in what we call the Tanakh and the Old Testament scriptures, this idea of God's invisibility is not a new concept. From the time of Moses onward, it's an essential tenet of the Hebrew faith and an important way that Israel distinguished itself from other nations. But for the churches that John is writing to in these letters, their population is very likely a mix of some followers of Jesus who are Jewish and many followers who have come from the nations who are Gentiles. They have been raised in the ways of the Greek pantheon under Roman rule in Greco-Roman cities. For them, they had grown up with visible gods. This can give us some insight into the very end of 1 John. If you skip ahead a little bit from the passage that we just read and look at the very last verse of 1 John, that's chapter 5, verse 21, you'll see John giving a brief warning against idolatry. The text simply stops there. It's done. There's no real conclusion, no final salutations, no benediction. It's tempting to overlook this last verse as just a quickly added final word of advice, like John reminding us to wash behind our ears or eat our vegetables. But this warning, I think, plays a big role in John's thinking, and by looking at some of the history of the city of Ephesus, we can gain some insight into how this last sentence in 1 John connects with the earlier passage that we just read. So, the city of Ephesus, where the churches receiving John's letters were very likely located, it was renowned throughout the ancient world for their idol worship, specifically of the Greek goddess Artemis, whom the Romans called Diana. The Ephesians had melded together an older Eastern understanding of Artemis with a newer Western understanding of who she was. And the result was a unique view of Artemis that elevated her as a goddess over many facets of life, including the animal kingdom and human fertility. This view of Artemis was so sweeping and it was so distinct that she was actually given her own name, Artemis Ephesia, and the residents of Ephesus created a spectacular monument to the goddess who bore their name. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it acted as kind of a gateway between the world of Ephesus and the wild world, owing to Artemis's supposed power over the animals. It was about twice the size of the Parthenon in Athens. It was made about 500 years before Jesus was born, and it took over a century to complete the initial build. It was famously burned down by a crazy arsonist named Herostratus on the day that Alexander the Great was born. And then it was rebuilt, slightly smaller, but still very magnificent in its beauty. Some scholars think that the idol of Artemis inside the temple may have been fashioned, at least in part, out of a meteorite that had fallen down to Earth. And that's partly based on some information we get in Acts 19, where we see the impact of the cult of Artemis on Ephesus. So in this story, in Acts 19, Paul has just arrived in Ephesus, and it's a very perilous time. And by the way, this takes place a few decades before John wrote these letters that we're studying. The rise of Christian belief within Ephesus had begun to threaten the cult of Artemis, and this is not a mere matter of philosophy or privately held religious beliefs. This is a critical issue of economics for the city. Temple rituals for Artemis and festivals in her honor and at-home displays that people could purchase were a thriving industry, and there was also international pilgrimage bringing even more industry into the city of Ephesus because people were coming in to see this spectacular temple. This was the economic lifeblood of the city. And at this point in history, the temple is thought to have been the world's largest bank. So there's a lot of money on the table here. There's a lot of concern. As Ephesians turn away from idolatry and embrace Christianity, they stop engaging with the temple practices and they stop buying images of the goddess to display in their homes. A tradesperson named Demetrius, who's not to be confused with the Demetrius that we see in 3 John, he's pretty upset about this, and he's upset about the threat to his silver business, which appears to primarily be making silver-plated shrines for people's homes to Artemis. He becomes so upset at this threat that he assembles a group of his fellow tradespeople, and he whips them up into a furor, and then he walks this newly enraged protest group over to the city's biggest theater, and along the way, they discover a couple of the Apostle Paul's traveling companions, who had become known in the city as his associates and known as followers of Jesus, and they drag those 2 men into the theater with them, apparently to set up some kind of kangaroo court to try them for crimes against the goddess. A Jewish man named Alexander tries to intervene, but because he also does not worship Artemis, because he is a Jew, he's shouted down for 2 hours with the chant, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Eventually, a city official addresses the angry crowd. He demonstrates his allegiance to Artemis by reminding the crowd that their temple to the goddess contains one of the sacred stones that fell from the sky, pointing to that meteor theory. But he also warns them that Rome will likely see this event, this demonstration, as a riot, and fear of an imperial crackdown makes them disperse, and they let the 2 companions of Paul go. The story demonstrates just how deeply ingrained the worship of idols was in Ephesus, and how much friction the rise of Christianity in the city was creating with the, well, for lack of a better phrase, the Artemis establishment. For a Gentile believer who had grown up worshiping this idol in Ephesus, renowned all over the globe for how beautiful it looked, and making the city a magnet for international travelers who wanted to see Artemis for themselves, transitioning to the worship of an invisible God who had no statue and no image was not easy. It was a completely different way of worshiping, of believing, and of acting. And adding to that difficulty was the fact that so many of these believers had never seen Jesus in person, and like us, would have to wait and hope for things they could not see. I think it's fair to say that there must have been great pressure and great temptation for many of these new believers popping up in Ephesus in the early decades of the church to abandon this difficult road and return to what they knew and what they could see, to return to idol worship. And this is why John feels so burdened for this new generation of believers as he writes. Idol worship not only provided them a sense of security because they could see the object of their faith, but it was also easier than John's directions for worshiping an invisible god. The worship of Artemis was mostly economic, and it played to the ambitions and the lusts of her followers. Put very simply, one could worship Artemis while still looking out for themselves and making themselves their number one priority. This wasn't an option for Christians. The way of Jesus means the way of loving our fellow believers and our neighbors, and prioritizing others as more important than ourselves, just as John tells us. If we don't love one another, we're just another obscure cult with restrictive rules and very little impact on the world outside of those strictures. If we don't love one another, we keep God hidden from view in a world that desperately needs to see him. Practicing that love for one another is how our faith grows, how it's strengthened and sharpened, and made an even more precise and more luminous instrument to shine the light of Jesus into the darkness. John's message to these churches in these letters is ultimately very reminiscent of the message that Jesus gave his disciples during the Last Supper. Jesus reminded his disciples of the sacrifice he was about to make, a sacrifice that would not be possible if he wasn't truly human and also truly God. Jesus reminds them that they are the branches and that he is the vine, and that they must remain close to him in the dark times that are coming, trusting in his guidance to light their way, just as we must abide in Jesus and allow him to abide in us in our time and in our age. And Jesus gave them a new command that John reiterates to us and to successive generations of Christians as the central focus of his writings to these churches who are struggling against the world and sometimes struggling against one another. Love one another, Jesus commanded, and John reminds us, as Jesus loved us, and in this way paint a picture of God's invisible kingdom that will lead others to him. There's so much more in these three letters that we could go over, and much more than we were able to go over in just 4 weeks. As I said, I really do wish I'd scheduled some more time for this. So don't be surprised if we come back this way sometime very soon. However, next week, Advent begins. We're starting that wonderful part of the church calendar where we begin to talk about our expectation of Jesus' birth and the coming of our Savior. So in light of that, over the next 4 weeks of Advent, we're going to be looking at the origins and the history of several famous Christmas carols and songs and seeing how they can help us better understand this season of waiting for Jesus' birth. I hope you'll join us. Until then, the Lord bless you this week, and we'll see you next time.